Here we'll take a look at an animation provided by our textbook. I started out here. You see the unequal heating from the sun beating down at the equator and very little sunlight at the polar regions. And you get this rising convective tower with the air circulating here from the equator to about 30 degrees north. This is known as the Hadley circulation cell. And the reason it doesn't go all the way up to the poles is because the Earth rotates. And what happens is the air up above, these red dashes correspond to the air aloft, way up here. That air is deflected to the right by the Coriolis force. And that sets up this subtropical jet stream, which is a strong westerly flow from west to east, which essentially makes a barrier for any further movement of air northward or towards the pole. And so the air piles up here and sinks and creates a high pressure here at 30 degrees north. And for that matter, it's very symmetric about the equator. In the southern hemisphere, you've got a high pressure at 30 degrees south, and this would be the subtropical high pressure region. Okay. Now, at the surface winds are characterized by blue. You get air flowing away from this high pressure, subtropical high at the surface, and into the equatorial low pressure regions here. And the air is deflected to the right by the Coriolis force in the northern hemisphere, giving you this northeast flow or the northeast trade winds in this region. In the southern hemisphere, it's quite symmetric. The air is deflected to the left as it travels along the surface toward the equator by the Coriolis force. It's deflected to the left, and that gives you southeast trade winds. Okay, at the surface, the airflow is away from this high pressure, subtropical high, and that's deflected to the right, giving you a strong westerly flow here at the surface. Okay, this is the westerly wind belt, and the United States, the lower 48 at least, is primarily in this westerly wind belt. The tip of Florida may be down here, but the contiguous U.S. is primarily in the westerly wind belt. Okay. The polar front is a line separating the very cold air mass in the polar regions from the warmer air to the south of it. And it's typically at about 60 degrees in the winter months. In the deep winter, it may come down a little bit further south, and sometimes even here in Vancouver, Washington, we get a blast of polar air coming down, and so it comes down as far as us sometimes. And in the summer months, it disappears completely because in the summer, the sun heats the northern hemisphere much more evenly. So winds and storms are not nearly as intense in the summer months. Up here, you have a polar circulation cell that's dominated by sinking air at the poles, cold, heavy sinking air at the poles. It rushes down along the surface to 60 degrees and then rises up to complete the circulation, the polar circulation cell. And the surface air is deflected to the right by the Coriolis force, giving rise to the polar easterlies, winds blowing primarily from the east, northeast, but they refer to this as the polar easterly wind belt. The polar jet we'll look at more, but it's up high near the tropopause, the boundary between the troposphere and stratosphere, and it flows very rapidly in excess of 100 miles per hour sometimes, and meanders quite a bit. This is not showing the true amount of meandering that's possible with the polar jet. Okay. The other thing that we can look at is we can turn labels on here and get all sorts of information, but the subtropical highs, the northeast trade winds, the intertropical convergence zone, where the northeast trade winds meet the southeast trade winds. That's a convergence zone. The other thing I should mention is that there's lots of storms here, thunderstorms. This is the rainiest part of the world by far along the intertropical convergence zone, and that follows the sun somewhat. It goes a little bit north in the summer months and south during the southern hemisphere summer. This area also is referred to as the doldrums. Winds become quite light there often. The same is true around 30 degrees north. You often get very light winds, and this would be referred to as the horse latitudes. This isn't on there. But okay, good.